Come on, Creed. How does it feel, knowing this whole room is quietly embarrassed for you?
All right, Blaze, let's...
It was just a joke. Don't take it to heart.
No, I'm serious. What do you even do all day while she's out there earning it? Netflix? Xbox? Titan, you've got about 48 hours left to enjoy that seat. Because the loser you're all laughing at is the man who's about to sign your termination papers.
Because no one in that ballroom knew, the man they were laughing at had quietly held 90% of this company's equity for 15 years. And what Zina, the woman still laughing beside me, never saw coming was that this secret had been waiting 15 years for exactly this moment. My name is Creed Kane. I'm 43 years old, and I've built my whole life around one quiet belief. A man's worth isn't measured by what he says about himself at a dinner table. It's measured by what he's willing to carry without ever saying a word about it. That belief was about to be tested in front of 40 of my wife's coworkers, under a chandelier in downtown Chicago, by people who were absolutely certain they already knew who I was. They didn't. And in about 90 seconds, I was going to find out that my wife had been laughing about me behind my back longer than I wanted to admit. Before we get into the story, sit with one number, 15. That's how many years I'd kept a secret from the woman I married. Not out of pride, but out of a promise I made to myself a long time ago. And that night, at a banquet table on the Magnificent Mile, that secret came within 2 sentences of spilling out on its own, whether I was ready for it or not. But let's rewind first, because you need to understand who I was before that toast, not who that ballroom thought I was. 3 hours earlier, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror in our brownstone in Bronzeville, straightening a plain charcoal tie, while Zaina hummed along to the radio in the next room, zipping herself into an emerald dress she'd bought for this exact night. She'd been talking about this company dinner for 2 weeks, Hawthorne Logistics' annual leadership banquet, held every year at the Chicago Marriott downtown Magnificent Mile. It was a big deal to her. Zina had spent 11 years climbing at that company, and this was the night she got to sit at the head table. I didn't mind being the man standing quietly behind her chair. I never had. My father used to tell me, back on our porch on the south side, "Son, you build quiet. Let the work speak when it's ready." I'd spent 15 years living by that. Some men need the room to know their name the second they walk in. I never needed that. I only needed Zina to know it. We drove up Lakeshore Drive with the windows cracked, the lake throwing back the last orange light of the evening, and Zina reached over and squeezed my hand at a red light. "You look handsome," she said. "Try to have fun tonight, okay? I know these things aren't really your scene." "I'll manage," I told her, and I meant it. I always managed. That was the whole shape of our marriage, Zaina in the spotlight, me in the doorway, content to watch her shine. I didn't know yet that in 3 hours, that doorway was going to become a stage. The ballroom at the Marriott was lit gold, glasses already clinking, servers moving between round tables with trays of champagne. Zaina was seated at the head table with the executives, and I sat beside her as her +1. Blaze Hale 2 seats down on my other side. 38 years old, sharp suit, sharper mouth, the kind of man who'd learned early that confidence is cheaper to fake than competence is to earn. I'd met Blaze twice before. Both times, he'd asked what I did for work, with a smile that already knew the answer would embarrass me. Tonight, 3 glasses of champagne in, he decided to ask in front of everyone. He stood, raised his glass toward me like he was proposing a toast, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Creed, be honest. How does it feel, being the guy who just comes along?" A few people chuckled, uncertain. Blaze grinned and pushed further. I mean, Zaina's out here closing seven-figure accounts, and you're what? Home by 6, checking the mail? The table laughed harder that time, and then Zaina laughed too. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind you force out to smooth over an awkward moment. She laughed loud, easy, genuine, like Blaze had just told the funniest joke of the night, and I was standing close enough to feel her shoulders shake against my arm. 15 years of marriage, and I had never once heard her laugh at me like that. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, all at the same time. Titan Hawthorne, the CEO, cleared his throat from the far end of the table, trying to wave the moment along. All right, Blaze, let's... But Blaze wasn't finished. No, I'm serious, he pressed, eyes bright with the kind of cruelty that mistakes itself for humor. What do you even do all day while she's out there earning it? Netflix? Xbox? More laughter, louder this time. I sat there, calm on the outside, remembering something I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. A bank statement Zaina had glimpsed on the kitchen counter 3 years earlier. A number too large for a man who supposedly did nothing. She'd looked at it for a second too long. Then she'd looked away and never asked me a single question about it. I'd wondered about that silence for 3 years. Now, watching her laugh at Blaze's joke, I finally understood it. Blaze leaned in for the kill shot. Come on, man. How does it feel to be the guy everyone in this room is quietly embarrassed for? I set down my fork. I stood up slowly, buttoned my jacket, and straightened my tie. The same plain charcoal tie I'd fixed in the mirror 3 hours earlier, back when I still thought this was going to be an easy night. I looked past Blaze, straight down the table at Titan Hawthorne. In that second, standing there in front of everyone, what drove me wasn't pride. It was 15 years of watching people mistake my patience for emptiness. What I feared most wasn't losing the company or the money. It was that Zaina had laughed like that because some part of her actually believed I was nothing, and I'd let her believe it by never once correcting her. What I wanted, more than justice, was simply to be seen, fully, finally, by the one person whose opinion of me had always mattered more than the whole room combined. And it was Titan's silence, his refusal to shut Blaze down, that told me the waiting was over. You've got about 48 hours left to enjoy that seat, Titan, I said, my voice even and unhurried. Because the loser you're all laughing at is the man who's about to sign your termination papers. The room went completely silent. Not a fork moved. Somewhere behind me, I heard a champagne flute tremble against a table. Zaina's hand, which had been resting on my arm all night, slipped away like it had touched something hot. Every eye in that ballroom turned to me. And for the first time in 15 years of standing quietly in doorways, I let them look. Because what none of them knew, what Zaina herself didn't fully know yet, was exactly how long I had been waiting to say it. Zaina caught up to me in the lobby, her heels clicking hard and fast against the marble floor of the Marriott. She grabbed my sleeve before I reached the revolving door, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. Creed, what did you just say in there? You own the company? I turned to face her, and for a second I just looked at her. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you're deciding how much of the truth they've earned. Zaina, I said quietly, I'm not the man who just comes along. I'm the man who kept this company from going bankrupt 15 years ago. She went pale under the lobby lights. What are you talking about? So I told her, not everything, not yet, but enough. 15 years back, when Hawthorne Logistics was 2 payrolls from collapse, I'd merged a small freight consulting firm I owned into their structure through a private buyout. Quietly holding 90% of the equity through a family holding trust my attorney structured to keep my name off any public filing. I stayed fully in control of it. I just never let the company itself know who was behind it. I still remembered that night clearly. A conference room smelling of stale coffee and desperation. 3 exhausted executives who didn't yet know my name, signing away control of a company they built from nothing. Because the alternative was 400 employees losing their jobs by Friday. I'd sat at the far end of that table in a rented suit, 28 years old, hands steady even though my chest wasn't, telling myself the quiet way was the right way. 15 years later, under those lobby chandeliers, I wondered for the first time if that had ever really been a choice, or just the only shape fear had ever let me take. I'd built it that way on purpose, my father's voice in my head, telling me a man doesn't need his name on the wall to know what he built. I liked coming home every night to a wife who loved me for being present, not for a number on a balance sheet. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" Zaina whispered, and I heard something crack in her voice. I didn't answer that yet. Standing there under the lobby chandeliers, with valets pulling cars around outside and a few stragglers from the banquet pretending not to stare, I thought about all the small moments over the years that should have told her something. The year I paid off the house in cash and told her it was a good refinance deal. The Christmas I quietly covered her mother's hospital bill and let her believe the insurance had come through. The number on that bank statement 3 years ago that she'd glanced at, then looked away from, the same way you look away from a stove burner you're not ready to touch. She'd had pieces of the truth in her hands more than once, she just hadn't wanted to hold them. I just took her hand and walked her out to the car. We drove home to Bronzeville in silence, the kind that sits heavier than any argument. Our brownstone came into view. The same porch light I'd installed the year we bought the place, the same oak door I still had to lean my shoulder into every winter. Inside, I walked straight to the bookshelf in my study, pressed my palm against the third panel from the left, and slid it open. Behind it was a safe, and behind the safe was a banker's box I hadn't opened in longer than I wanted to admit. I pulled out the file. 15 years of paperwork, merger documents, trust filings, tax records, and tucked in among them, an old voice memo I'd transferred off one of Zaina's old phones years back, the way I used to back up her devices before every upgrade, and had simply never deleted. The study was dark except for the desk lamp and the streetlight leaking through the blinds. Zaina frozen in the doorway behind me, arms crossed over the emerald dress she still hadn't changed out of. My thumb hovered over the play button longer than it should have. I hit play, more out of habit than intention, and Zaina's voice, 28 years old, right around the time we married, came out of the speaker, talking to a friend at what sounded like a backyard barbecue. Creed doesn't really do much, if I'm honest. But it's strange. There's always just enough. More than enough, actually. The room went quiet except for that recording. I watched Zaina's face fall apart in real time. I'd found that recording 11 years ago, going through old backups while setting up a new laptop, and I never said a word about it. Some part of me told myself I was protecting our peace. The truer part of me, the part I'm only honest about now, was afraid that if I confronted her, I'd find out she meant it, that somewhere underneath the wife who kissed me goodnight, there was a woman quietly keeping score of what I wasn't. So I buried it the way I buried everything, by working harder and saying less, and telling myself that silence was the same thing as strength. Zaina sank onto the arm of the couch, mascara already starting to smear. "I remember that day," she said, barely audible. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I was just, everyone else's husband was, I don't know, a doctor, a partner at some firm. I felt embarrassed, and I didn't even understand why. Because you never once let us go without." "I know," I said. And I did know. I'd known for 11 years and never said anything, which was its own kind of failure. One I wasn't ready to name out loud yet. I called my attorney that same night, a woman named Deborah Marsh who'd handled the original trust filing 15 years earlier. I asked her to bring in her forensic accounting team and open a full audit of Hawthorne Logistics contracts, going back 3 years, starting with anything touching Blaze Hale's desk. The audit landed in my inbox 40 hours later, on the second morning after the banquet, right on pace with the 48 hours I'd promised Titan in front of that whole ballroom. And it was worse than I expected. Blaze had been steering shipping contracts toward a logistics vendor owned by his cousin, skimming margin off nearly every deal that passed through his hands for the better part of 2 years. Deborah's team put the total damage somewhere north of $600,000, buried across dozens of invoices small enough that no one had ever thought to add them up. And buried in an internal email chain she flagged for me, I found something else. Blaze, writing to a colleague, forwarding gossip he'd apparently told Zaina more than once at office happy hours. Between us, her husband's dead weight, no ambition, no career. I don't know how she does it. I read that line 3 times, sitting alone at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the porch light still burning outside the window, the way it had every night for 15 years. It wasn't the money that got to me, it was the timestamps. 2 years of that talk, feeding quietly into my own marriage, 1 happy hour at a time, and I never even knew I had a rival for my wife's respect. I had him terminated within the hour, through HR, effective immediately, security escort and all. Zaina's text started coming in right after, frantic, apologetic, confused. I looked at my phone once, typed back 4 words, and set it face down on my desk. Typical Tuesday, I wrote. I wasn't being cruel. I want to be clear about that, because a lesser man might have used that moment to humiliate her, the way Blaze had humiliated me, and God knows I thought about it. But underneath the calm, what I actually felt was grief, plain and simple. Not for the company, not for the money. For the 15 years I'd spent believing my silence was protecting something worth protecting, when really, I'd just been giving a man like Blaze Hale 15 years of open field to plant doubt in my own marriage. Because here's the part that kept me up that whole night. Zaina hadn't just laughed at Blaze's joke on a whim. She had chosen, somewhere along the way, to believe a man who barely knew me over the husband who'd spent a decade and a half quietly making sure she never had to worry about a single bill. So now I want to ask you the same question I couldn't stop asking myself that night, lying awake next to a woman I still loved and no longer fully trusted. Comment yes if a husband has the right to test his wife's loyalty by hiding the truth for 15 years. Or comment no if that silence makes him just as guilty as the wife who chose to believe a stranger over him. Team Creed or Team Zaina? Pick one before segment 3. Because Creed is about to walk into that boardroom and show everyone exactly what 15 years of silence had been building toward. 48 hours, almost to the minute, after I'd made that promise to Titan in front of the whole ballroom, I walked into Hawthorne Logistics' executive offices on the Magnificent Mile as the majority owner of the company for the first time in 15 years. Not as a silent partner, not as a name buried in a trust filing, but as the man in the room everyone had to answer to. Titan Hawthorne was already seated at the head of the boardroom table when I walked in, and I watched the color drain out of his face the moment Deborah set the trust documents down in front of him. The room smelled like burnt coffee from a pot no one had refreshed since the morning meeting, and somewhere down the hall a printer kept jamming and restarting, the only sound breaking the silence while Titan turned page after page. My own pulse was steady, but some old, stubborn part of me, the part that had once respected this man, still hoped, for half a second, that he'd look up and simply own what he'd let happen. 62 years old, a man who'd once had real vision for this company, now just a tired executive who'd let comfort talk him into looking away from what Blaze Hale had been doing under his own roof. He knew what those documents meant before he finished reading the first page. Creed, he said carefully, I think we should discuss this privately. Off the record, before anything, there's nothing to discuss. I said. I didn't raise my voice. I never have needed to. You had a duty to catch what Blaze was doing to this company, and you didn't because it was easier not to look. Effective immediately, you're terminated as CEO of Hawthorne Logistics. Security walked him out through the same lobby where I used to stand quietly in the mornings, badge quipped to my belt, nobody in that building ever guessing I owned 90% of what they worked for. Nobody stopped him to say goodbye. Nobody said anything at all. Then I turned to the board and said the name I'd been carrying in my back pocket for longer than any of them realized. I'm nominating Asha Moore as the next CEO of this company. A murmur ran down the table. Asha was a 35-year-old engineer who'd spent 9 years in Hawthorne's operations division, passed over for promotion 4 separate times by men with half her competence and twice her comfort with a golf course. She'd redesigned the entire warehouse routing system in her second year on the job, saving the company close to $200,000 annually, and watched the credit for it get folded quietly into someone else's year-end review. She never filed a complaint. She just kept working, kept documenting, kept being right, long after it should have mattered to somebody. She walked into that boardroom still in a company polo and khakis, straight off the floor of the distribution center, sawdust and diesel still faint on her sleeve. She didn't apologize for it. She looked me dead in the eye, and what she said next stopped my breath for a second. "Did you get the anonymous emails I sent 5 years ago?" she asked quietly. "About the discrepancies in Titan's procurement contracts?" I always wondered if someone out there was actually reading them. I figured whoever it was must have been waiting for the right moment. I had gotten those emails, every single one, routed to a private inbox Deborah managed for exactly this kind of thing, 5 years before I ever had solid enough proof to move on Titan without burning the whole company down in the process. I'd built a habit, over 15 years, of collecting truth quietly and sitting on it until the moment it could do the most good with the least damage. A habit that had protected this company more than once, and, I was starting to realize that same week, a habit that had also quietly cost me at home. Asha's question landed somewhere I wasn't fully ready for. Proof that I hadn't just been a patient man. I'd been a man willing to let good people wait years for justice, because I trusted my own timing more than I trusted telling anyone the truth. I read every one, I told her. I'm sorry it took this long. She nodded like that was answer enough, and that told me everything about the kind of leader she was going to be. A few board members pushed back. A man named Reeves, silver-haired and comfortable, cleared his throat and said something about process and precedent, about how promoting someone straight off the operations floor sends the wrong message to the leadership pipeline. I let him finish. Then I asked him a simple question. How many times had Asha Moore's name come up for promotion in the last 4 years? And how many times had it been passed over in favor of someone he golfed with on Saturdays? Reeves didn't have an answer for that either. Deborah laid the forensic audit out on the table in front of everyone. Blaze's contracts, the $600,000 in skimmed margin, Titan's signature on approvals he never should have rubber-stamped. The objections died fast after that, the way objections always do once the numbers are sitting right there on the table in black and white. By the end of the meeting, Asha Moore had been formally appointed CEO of Hawthorne Logistics, and Titan Hawthorne had been terminated the same afternoon, escorted off a property he no longer had any claim to. I watched something settle into place in that room that had been crooked for a very long time. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was just correct, finally, after years of not being. I stood there another moment after everyone filed out, alone at the head of a table that had never once had my name on the building's directory, and let myself feel it. Not triumph, just a long overdue exhale, 15 years in the making. Then I heard the click of heels stop just outside the door, and I knew, before I even turned around, that Zaina was still standing in that hallway, waiting. After the meeting broke up, Zaina pulled me into an empty conference room down the hall and shut the door behind us. Her hands were trembling. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. The woman who'd sat through 15 years of budget meetings without so much as a shaky pen. And now, her hands wouldn't hold still. "Did you know all of this from the beginning?" she asked. Her voice was so quiet, I had to lean in to catch it over the hum of the building's air conditioning. "Creed, I almost filed for divorce 6 months ago. I had the paperwork drawn up. I sat with it in my car in the parking garage for almost an hour one night, trying to decide if I was brave enough to hand it to you. I thought, Blaze kept telling me you'd never amount to anything, that I was carrying this marriage alone, and he was so comforting about it. And I—" Her voice cracked and she pressed her palm flat against her mouth, like she could physically stop the rest of the sentence from coming out. I waited. I've learned that silence, held the right way, gets people to finish sentences they'd otherwise swallow. "There's something else," she said finally, barely above a whisper. A few years ago, Blaze showed me a copy of a document, a merger filing. It had your name on it, next to a company valuation that didn't make any sense to me. I remember looking at it and thinking, this has to be fake. There's no way. Creed doesn't own anything like this. So I told myself it was some kind of scam Blaze was trying to pull, and I never brought it up. Not to you, not to anyone. I stood there for a long moment, looking at my wife, feeling something in my chest that wasn't anger exactly, something quieter and heavier than anger. The particular ache of watching someone hold real proof of your worth in their hands and set it down because believing it felt harder than doubting you. "You had it in your hands," I said slowly, "years ago, and you decided it couldn't be true." Zaina didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. Her eyes filled, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched Zaina Kane, polished, composed, always in control of a room, have absolutely nothing left to say. "You've been choosing who to believe for a long time now, Zaina," I said, my voice steady, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. And it wasn't me. I turned and walked out of that conference room, leaving her standing there with the truth she'd been avoiding for years, finally sitting in the room with nowhere left to hide. Because what neither of us knew yet was that the truth had one more layer left to peel back, and it was waiting for us at home. 20 minutes later, once my head had cleared enough to remember she still needed a ride, I found Zaina waiting by my car in the parking garage, arms wrapped around herself against the wind coming off the lake. Neither of us said a word. She got in, and I drove us home to Bronzeville. The streetlights sliding past the window, her mascara already ghosting down toward her cheekbones in the glow of them. We walked into the house, and she turned to face me in the middle of the living room, her voice breaking apart. "You hid this from me for 15 years, Creed! 15 years! I laughed with them at that table because I was embarrassed. Do you understand what that felt like? Sitting there thinking my husband had nothing to show for himself." I stood in the doorway of my own living room and let a memory surface that I'd kept buried even longer than the bank statements. 11 years ago, I said quietly, I had an offer from a firm in New York. Double my salary, better title, better everything on paper. I sat with that offer letter on this same kitchen table for a week, Zaina, running the numbers, imagining what our life would look like in Manhattan. Zaina's face went still. I turned it down. I never told you the details because you were 3 months from a promotion at Hawthorne, and moving would have cost you that. Cost you the corner office you'd worked 6 years to earn. I chose your career over my own that year, quietly, the way I chose most things. And a few months later, at a barbecue I wasn't even at, I heard secondhand that you'd told your girlfriends I didn't have any real ambition. I never corrected it. I just let you believe whatever was easier to carry. Zaina's knees seemed to give out from under her. She sank down onto the floor, back against the couch, and cried the way I hadn't seen her cry since her father's funeral. Full body, no performance in it at all. Just grief finally catching up to years of things left unsaid. "There's something else," she said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, her voice dropping to something barely audible. "Something I haven't told you. 8 months ago, I opened a separate account. I've been moving small amounts out of our joint savings every payday since. Never enough for you to notice on a statement, just enough to have something of my own in case I ever needed to leave fast." I told myself it was just being smart, but some part of me was already planning a way out, Creed, long before I had a single real reason to. "How much?" I asked, and I heard how flat my own voice sounded. "A little over $11,000, she said. "I was going to tell you eventually. I just don't know when eventually was supposed to come." I thought, unbidden, of the afternoon we'd opened our first joint account 14 years earlier. A folding table at a credit union on 47th Street. Zaina laughing at how seriously I filled out the paperwork. Both our names inked side by side on a form I still kept a photocopy of in my desk drawer. I remembered thinking, watching her sign next to me, that a marriage was just two people agreeing to stop keeping separate ledgers. Standing in that living room 15 years later, I understood I'd broken that agreement long before she had. Just quietly enough that it never looked like betrayal. I stood there, watching her come apart on our living room floor, and I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Then my phone rang. It was Adeze Banks, Zaina's mother, calling from her house out in Oak Park, Illinois. I put her on speaker so Zaina could hear. "Creed, baby," Adeze said, and I could hear her voice shaking, 70 years old and unsteady in a way I'd never once heard from her in 15 years of holiday dinners. "I need to say something to you, and I need Zaina to hear it too." "Go ahead, Adeze." "I told Zaina to leave you, years ago, more than once. I thought you didn't have any real drive, any real future, and I was scared for my daughter's life, so I pushed her toward doubting you every chance I got. I didn't know, Creed, I didn't know you were the one who paid off my hospital bills 3 years running. I found out from my church treasurer last month, when she mentioned an anonymous donor who'd covered my whole cardiac unit stay, and something told me to ask more questions. It was you the whole time, wasn't it?" Zaina looked up at me from the floor, her whole face rearranging itself around a truth she clearly hadn't seen coming. "It was me," I said simply. Adeze's voice cracked further. "I found the bank transfers on an old statement 2 years ago, Creed. Large ones, no name attached, going out around the same time my bills always seemed to disappear. I suspected it was you even then. I just didn't ask, because if I asked and it was true, I'd have had to admit I was wrong about you for 15 years. And I wasn't ready to be that wrong about a man I'd spent so long looking down on." She paused, and I heard her take a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "You have to understand, Creed. Where I come from, a man's worth got measured by what he could show you. A title, a car in the driveway. I judged you by a yardstick that never once accounted for a man who'd rather do good quietly than be thanked for it loudly. That's on me, not on you." On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint tick of her kitchen clock, the same one that had hung over her stove since before Zaina and I ever met. Zaina's hand found the edge of the couch cushion and gripped it, knuckles pale, like she needed something solid to hold on to while her mother's voice rearranged 15 years of assumptions. The room went very quiet. Zaina and her mother, both women who'd spent years deciding what kind of man I was without ever fully asking me, sat with that silence together. One on the living room floor, one on the other end of a phone line 40 minutes away. I looked at Zina, then toward the phone on the coffee table, and I said the thing I'd been carrying, unspoken, since the moment I walked out of that ballroom 2 nights earlier. Do you two understand something? That night at the Marriott, if I'd let my anger get the better of me and walked out of that ballroom without canceling what I'd already queued up, every board member at Hawthorne and 2 reporters at the Tribune would have received a video and a full set of documents by 6 the next morning. Everything. The trust filing, Blaze's contracts, the recording, all of it. I'd built that failsafe 8 months earlier, quietly, the same way I'd built everything else. Not out of a desire for revenge, but because a part of me had already sensed, long before that dinner, that the truth in my marriage and in that company was going to come out one way or another. And I wanted to control how much damage it did when it finally did. What I hadn't expected was how close I'd come to actually using it, out of pure hurt rather than principle. And that gap between the man who built a plan to protect people and the man who almost pressed a button out of wounded pride was the closest I'd come in 15 years to becoming someone I wouldn't have respected. I had it scheduled, I said, my voice quieter now, set to send automatically if I didn't cancel it by midnight. I had my thumb over the cancel button and I almost let it go through, the second I heard you laugh at that table, Zina. I wanted to burn all of it down right then. But I didn't press it, because whatever else has happened this week, I still love this family, both of you. Zina put both hands over her face and sobbed harder than I'd ever heard her cry in 15 years of marriage. On the phone, Adeze had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that comes from a person finally understanding the full weight of what they almost lost. I didn't say anything else. I turned, walked up the stairs to our bedroom, and left the 2 of them down there, with everything that had just been laid bare between us. Behind me, I could hear Zina's crying soften into something quieter, more exhausted, the sound of a person who has run all the way to the end of their own excuses and finally has nowhere left to stand but in the truth. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long while, listening to the house settle around me the way it always did that time of night. And I thought about my father's voice again. Build quiet, son, and let the work speak when it's ready. I wondered, for the first time in 15 years, if he'd ever meant for that silence to go on for quite this long. Because some truths need room to breathe before anyone can figure out what to do with them next. What none of us knew yet, standing in the wreckage of that night, was whether my wife and I would ever find our way back to something worth calling a marriage, or whether 15 years of silence had already cost us more than either of us could repair. 3 months later, I was back at the Chicago Marriott downtown Magnificent Mile. The same ballroom, the same chandeliers throwing gold light across round tables, but the room felt like a completely different place. This time, it was the company's annual awards dinner, and the air didn't carry that same brittle, competitive edge it used to. People actually looked at each other when they spoke. Asha Moore stood at the podium in a tailored blazer that fit her the way authority is supposed to fit a person, like it had always belonged to her, not like she was borrowing it. "I'd like to welcome someone up here," she said, and I could hear real pride in her voice, not performance. "Please welcome Creed Kane, the man who changed the entire culture of this company, quietly, for 15 years, before any of us even knew his name." I walked up in a simple charcoal suit, no different from the one I'd worn to that first banquet 3 months earlier, and looked out over the room. In the 3rd row, Zina sat in a plain navy dress, hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in longer than I could remember. Not the corporate smile she used to wear at these things, just quiet, honest respect. For half a second, standing at that podium, I heard Blaze's voice again. How does it feel, being the guy who just comes along? Clear as it had been in that same room 3 months before. I let it pass through me, the way you let a train go by at a crossing. Loud, then gone, then quiet track again. I kept my remarks short. The sweetest kind of justice, I told the room, isn't tearing something down. It's rebuilding it better than it was before, and making sure the people who deserved credit all along finally get it. I looked toward Asha as I said it. In the 3 months since her appointment, Hawthorne Logistics had cleared out every contract Blaze had touched, restructured its procurement process with outside oversight, and promoted 6 employees from the operations floor into leadership roles they'd earned years earlier and never received. It wasn't revenge, it was correction, long overdue. I stepped down off that stage to genuine applause, the kind that isn't performed for the person clapping next to you. And I caught Blaze's old seat at table 4, now occupied by a young logistics coordinator named Priya, who'd been passed over for his job the year before under the old regime. She caught my eye and gave me a small, grateful nod. That was worth more to me than anything Titan Hawthorne had ever put his name on. After the ceremony, Zaina and I drove home to Bronzeville together, and for the first time in 3 months, the silence in the car didn't feel like a wall between us. It felt like 2 people finally resting. We sat out on the back porch afterward, the swing creaking under us the same way the one on my father's porch used to, a few blocks over in the house I grew up in. The night was cool. The kind of late Chicago evening where you can hear the L train 2 streets over and somebody's dog barking at nothing in particular. My laptop bag sat by the back door where I'd dropped it after work, and some part of me was still aware of the file inside it. The failsafe, still live, still scheduled. A habit I hadn't yet found the courage to break. I let my eyes rest on it for a moment, then let it go, and turned back toward the sound of the swing chain creaking under Zaina's weight beside me. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you," Zaina said finally, her voice small in a way I wasn't used to from her. "Not that night at the dinner. Not for 15 years before it, if I'm honest with myself. I let people underestimate you because it was easier than defending a version of you I wasn't sure I understood." I took her hand, not the trembling grip from that conference room 3 months earlier, just a steady, ordinary hand-holding, the kind married people do without thinking about it. "We'll start again," I told her. "But this time, we do it with the truth between us instead of around us." There was no dramatic embrace, no tears this time. Just 2 people who'd been married 15 years, sitting on a porch, choosing each other again, with their eyes open instead of closed. And for once, the quiet between us didn't feel like something either of us needed to fill. A week later, Adeze showed up at our door unannounced, carrying a pound cake still warm enough to fog the plastic wrap. She stood on the porch for a second before I opened the screen door, and when she finally looked up at me, there was something different in her face. Not the wary politeness she'd always shown me at holidays, but something closer to humility. "I brought this for you, son," she said, and I noticed she'd never once called me that in 15 years of Thanksgivings and Easter dinners. "I owe you more than a cake, but it's a start." We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, and Adeze told Zaina things she'd apparently been carrying alone for years. How she'd pushed her toward doubt out of her own fear. How she'd found evidence of my quiet generosity and chosen silence over admitting she'd been wrong about a man for a decade and a half. "I judged you the way this world taught me to judge a man," she told me, "by what he showed off. I'm sorry it took me 70 years and a hospital bill to learn better." Later that night, after Adeze had gone home, I stood alone on the back porch and looked out over the Chicago skyline, the lights strung along the lake like something out of a postcard. There was a stillness in my chest I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Not relief exactly, not the tired, performed kind of okay you put on for other people's sake. Something closer to peace. Real peace, the quiet kind that shows up uninvited once you've stopped needing to perform strength for anyone. But somewhere underneath that calm, one question was still sitting with me, and I suspected it always would. If I hadn't canceled that send before the deadline I'd set for myself 3 months ago, if I'd let it go through the way some part of me wanted to that night, would any of this have been possible at all? I didn't have an answer yet, but I was starting to understand that some questions don't need answering. They just need you to keep choosing the right thing, one ordinary evening at a time, until the question stops mattering as much as it used to. I stood on the back porch of our house in Bronzeville, looking out over the Chicago skyline the way I had 100 nights before. And I thought about something my father used to say to me on a porch not so different from this one, a few blocks over, back when I was young enough to still be figuring out what kind of man I wanted to be. "Son," he'd say, "build quiet. Do it for your family, and do it for our people. One day, the truth speaks for you, and it says more than you ever could." Zaina came out to join me, wrapped in the cardigan she always kept on the hook by the back door. She already knew about the fail-safe. I'd told her and her mother both, that night with the phone on speaker. What she didn't know was what I planned to do about it now. I set my laptop down on the porch railing and pulled up the file. The scheduled send, the trust documents, Blaze's contracts, the recording, all of it, still sitting live and ready 3 months after I'd built it. I turned the screen so she could see it. "I've kept this running since the night of the banquet," I told her, just in case. I think some part of me needed to know I still could, even after everything settled down. I found the delete confirmation and clicked it, watched the little window blink twice and close. I don't need it anymore. Zaina didn't say anything at first. She just stepped closer and wrapped both arms around me, her face pressed into my shoulder, and I felt her whole body shake with a kind of crying that wasn't about embarrassment or fear anymore. It was something more like relief. For the first time in longer than I could count, I felt the truth sitting in her arms, along with everything else. No performance, no polish, just two people who'd finally run out of things to hide from each other. "From now on," I said quietly into her hair, "we don't hide things from each other. However much it hurts, we tell each other the truth. That's the only kind of marriage worth having." She nodded against my shoulder, and for a while, neither of us said anything else. We just stood there on that porch, listening to the city hum in the distance, letting the silence between us finally mean something good instead of something guarded. In the weeks that followed, something small but real started to change between us. Zaina started asking me about my day, the way she used to when we were newlyweds, and actually waiting for the answer, instead of half listening while she scrolled through her phone. I started telling her things I would have swallowed a year earlier. A hard conversation with a vendor, a decision I wasn't sure about, small, ordinary worries I used to carry alone, because I'd convinced myself that was my job. We started having Sunday dinners with Adeze again, and this time she asked me questions about the company, instead of steering the conversation towards Zaina's career like mine didn't exist. It wasn't dramatic, it was just steadier. The way a house feels different once you finally fix the foundation instead of just repainting the walls. I won't pretend some part of me doesn't still carry a quiet edge underneath all that peace. Late that night, lying awake next to my wife, I caught myself thinking, if the day ever comes when either of them forgets what almost happened, I still remember exactly how to build that file again. Not out of bitterness, just out of the same instinct that had protected me for 15 years. A man builds quiet, and he keeps something in reserve because self-respect isn't a one-time decision. It's a habit you keep, even after the people you love have earned your trust back. This story reminds us that respect in a marriage was never about who brought home the bigger paycheck. It was about whether you actually stopped long enough to see the person sitting across the table from you. The quiet sacrifices, the bills paid without announcement, the things they gave up so you wouldn't have to. If you're in a house that's quieter than it used to be, here's something to do tonight instead of just missing him. Before the kitchen light goes off, pull down the recipe box he never once complained about eating from for 40 years, and write one thing on an index card he never got thanked for out loud. The Sunday drives, the shoveled walk, the way he always let you pick the restaurant. Tape it inside the cabinet door, where you'll see it tomorrow morning with your coffee. If you buried a husband or a wife this year, don't wait for the ache to get smaller before you do something with it. This Saturday, hand your grandson the toolbox that's been sitting untouched in the garage, and teach him to change a light bulb the exact way she taught you. Let that be how her patience keeps showing up in the world, one grandchild at a time. And if you're still at that kitchen table together after all these years, tell them the truth tonight, out loud, about one thing you've been carrying alone. Not because staying quiet makes you weak. Creed's silence built something remarkable. But because the people who love us can't honor what we never let them see. Truth and dignity take their time, but they arrive, one honest evening at a time. This story was written by a human, with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish, to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.